Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining the TBLI podcast, Radical Truth. Today, I'm quite honored and happy to have Professor Martin Parker from Bristol University. He will be sharing his journey, which is quite unique for a university professor. So I don't want to get into too many details of who you are, what you do. So, Martin, for those that are not familiar with you and your work and your writings and your teachings, tell us a bit about who you are, what you do at Bristol University and other places, and what is your big purpose?
Okay, my big purpose. Well, thanks for having me, Robert. Really flattered to be
My
asked to
pleasure.
speak today. Um, I guess if I was going to do a very quick potted biography, I've been an academic all my life, really, apart from brief stints cleaning supermarket floors and various other things. Um, but it's kind of important that I say my background is in sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies. So even though I've spent most of my time working within business schools in the UK, I don't feel like I'm of the business school. I'm a stranger in a strange land to some extent. And that's kind of important in terms of the way in which I have, over the last 2, 3 decades, um, sort of styled myself, I guess, as a kind of an internal critic of business schools and what they do. Um, so I suppose the kind of most relevant thing to say for our viewers and listeners is that for quite a long time now, I've been writing various kinds of books and publications and speaking and so on in this general sort of anti-managerial vein. One of my early books was called Against Management, and it was an attempt to think about what it might mean to organize beyond management, if you like, rather than assuming that management is a necessary corollary of thinking about organizing. And then there's a series of bits and pieces that I do over the intervening period, which are kind of moving into an interest in alternative economy and organizing. So particularly interested in thinking about different ways in which we might think about organization without hierarchy, without specialist organizers that we call managers, and encouraging the development of a low carbon, high inclusion, high democracy economy. And then moving to Bristol, rather bizarrely, I was given a job just after I published a book called Shut Down the Business School, which was a deliberately provocative title that my publisher was quite keen on. But despite that, they gave me a job at the University of Bristol. We didn't have a business school at that point. But the success of my title has been such that Bristol University has now started its own business school. So clearly the Vice Chancellor wasn't listening when they attended the lecture at which I presented that book. But, that's okay. At Bristol University, I've been spending a lot of time trying to find ways to connect the business school to the city. We live in a really interesting city with lots of fascinating initiatives and activists, particularly around the general idea of green and sustainable economies. And I've been trying to make sure that we are connected into that stuff as much as possible. So that's the potted bio, Robert.
Okay, but you were teaching at a business school course, and if so, for how long?
So I think, well, I was a sociology lecturer up until 1995, and then got a job in a small management school. And so I've been, well, 95. So yeah, I've been in business school, business or management schools for the last 30 years. So yes, yeah, my kind of, my sense of myself is still that I don't belong to the business school, but they've certainly been paying my wages for the last 3 decades.
But you don't teach the traditional management courses at Bristol.
Well, we do. I mean, most business schools tend to have quite similar curricula, really. So we have, courses on organizational behavior and strategy and operations and all the rest of it. I'm impatient with those classifications, but let's set that to one side. One of the things that I've been trying to encourage all the way through my career really is that we teach those things in different ways, so that even if we accept the overall classifications, and they're basically classifications that we kind of inherit from American business schools, at the
Mm.
start of the 20th century, that we can teach that stuff differently. So, if we think about, I don't know, questions about operations and management and supply chains and whatever else, we can teach those things in the knowledge of the carbon costs of moving stuff around the planet or whatever. So, even if the problem, the box, if you like, is the same, I still think that it can be understood as a different sort of problem.
You were giving me some incredible statistics about the phenomenal growth of global business schools.
Mm, mm.
If you can kind of repeat
Sure.
what you were telling me about the numbers, the money that they're
Yeah.
making. I'm also very critical of business. We'll get into that
Yeah.
in a bit. But just to put it in context, how big is the business school business?
Mm. It's enormous, and it's the largest single part of global higher education. We shouldn't think that the business school complex is just about the US and the highly ranked schools in the US. So the figures, if we look at the UK, according to the latest figures, something like 1 in 7 students are studying some variant of business and management or marketing. If
Whoa.
you look at Europe, the Eurostat figures give somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 of students across Northwestern Europe studying business management marketing. And if you look at the global figures, it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5, something like that. So this is by far the biggest part of higher education. There's plenty of other, there's people studying physics and biology and chemistry and literature and all the rest of it. But the biggest chunk of that right the way across the globe is higher education. And I think that's is business management. And I think the important thing about that is to understand some of the reasons that that's the case, and doubtless we'll be talking about this over the next over the rest of this podcast, but also thinking about some of the consequences for that, the way in which higher education, if you like, has changed by not only reproducing particular sets of managerial ideas, but very often applying those ideas to its own practices too.
And why do you, I mean, this growth happened in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago? When did it start?
It does vary. I mean, in the UK, we see the really explosive growth from the kind of 80s onwards, something like that. And
Mm.
virtually every university, with the exception of the one that I'm in, actually, got itself a business school by the 1990s, 2000s. That this was an area that was really expanding very, very fast indeed. Other countries do differ because obviously it's embedded in certain places, say in the US and Canada, much, much earlier than that. But effectively, it becomes kind of it becomes kind of fashionable in the last 25 years of the 20th century, and you can see business schools starting to crop up. Um, Many of them private business schools. India's got an awful lot of private business schools, for example, but many others being business schools which are embedded within traditional higher education institutions. But effectively, we could say, if we were summarizing, in the last 50 years, global higher education has been really transformed by the existence and demand for business school education.
And is it mainly because there those who are, I mean, the range of pricing, obviously, I'm sure in India it's not a couple of $100,000 to do an education, so there's a wide range of pricing for that. Is it mainly because you have a greater guarantee of finding a job? Or is it people believe, oh, I want to, it's more about the networking, so I want to build my network.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean,
I
those are
don't really
really
believe it's about the content.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions, aren't they? And to my knowledge, they haven't actually been empirically tested. So certainly the business school sells the idea that this is the course that guarantees employability. So if you look at business school websites, for example, very often they would be making implicit promises about investing in you and what those kind of investments might produce. So, ideas
Right.
about starting salaries or particular kinds of organizations, or, pictures of excitable people jumping on and off aeroplanes, or, in first class lounges at airports or whatever else. They're selling a particular kind of fairy dust here. To my knowledge, there's never been any empirical test of whether getting a business school degree actually
Mm.
guarantees that you're more likely to get a highly paid job. There has been quite a lot of data, and that's collected over a very long time by sociologists, on the kinds of institutions that are more likely to guarantee you highly paid jobs. And unsurprisingly, what we see there is it's elite institutions. So if you've done a English literature degree at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, wherever, you're quite likely to end up in a reasonably well-paid job because of the cultural capital that employs.
Mm.
If you've done a business school degree in a low-ranking university, then that seems unlikely to guarantee that you're going to be able to suddenly jump up the social mobility ladder and occupy a very different kind of position. So I'm not sure that business schools are actually doing what they claim to do very often. The other thing that you mentioned there is the kind of networking stuff. And there
Yeah.
is some data now about the effect that, say, going to Harvard or London Business School or somewhere has in terms of the kind of people that you hang around with. And that being pretty advantageous for your career too. So in some senses, you could argue that the business school is a kind of a sort of a social club of some description, where
Mm.
people with certain kinds of aspirations and probably certain kinds of backgrounds too meet to network. So in that sense, it's still doing pretty much what elite institutions have been doing for a long time. You go to Oxford or Cambridge and you're likely to be helped by other people from Oxford or Cambridge and to meet certain kinds of people who are moving in fairly elite circles and so on.
The I believe it or not, in a previous life, I taught over a 4-year period at a so-called ranked MBA school,
Mm-hmm.
Rotterdam School of Management, and actually I was asked to teach at IE in Madrid, but that's only because I embarrassed the the dean at a seminar there, saying that he had no courses on sustainable investing, and all their students in the audience wanted it. So he invited him, but I knew he wasn't really serious about this. The thing that struck me, which I didn't know that the rankings of business school had nothing to do with education or the quality of the education. It was only based on the salary you earned when you left. So where are the best ranked schools? In the countries that pay very well. Could there be a great business school in the Philippines or Cambodia or India? Sure. The largest business school, I think, was Baruch College. At one time,
Yeah.
they had the largest number of students, but were never really ranked seriously.
Yeah.
Is that true about the ranking based on the salary and not on the educational quality?
I mean, rankings are constructed in slightly different ways depending on which institutions you're talking about and different national territories and so on as well. But sure, I mean, in general, the idea that rankings tell us very much about education isn't a useful assumption, is it? So, if you, for example, factor in starting salaries, then you'd need to, in order for that to be a meaningful statistic, you'd need to know something about the origins of the students who were going into these kinds of places. So if we took somewhere like London Business School, which is currently charging now over £100,000 for its MBA course, it's pretty likely that the kind of people who are capable of paying or being sponsored for over £100,000 are people who are coming from fairly elite backgrounds already. So their starting salaries are likely to be reasonably high, as opposed to somebody who's going to a local community college business school or something like that, who might have a very different class background or ethnic background or whatever. Then of course it's highly likely that their starting salaries won't be as good. So simply taking starting salaries is not a good statistic for thinking about education. In any case, it seems to me that the whole question of rankings is a misleading one, in the sense if you want to talk about the content of particular courses, degrees, of modules, the kind of people who might be teaching you and their interests, that's going to be a much more politically nuanced question, isn't it? It's going to be something about the kinds of interests that you have and the way in which they might be reflected in the interests of the staff who are teaching you. And in that sense, the ranking isn't touching that stuff. You know, if you want to really know something about how your organizational behavior class is going to be taught in terms of the assumptions about human beings that might be embedded into that, then you're going to need to know a lot more about, you know, what the textbook is or who the lecturer was or what their interests are and so on. So much more specific than simply thinking about rankings. Indeed, I mean,
When I was teaching, they had me. I didn't understand this. I think a third or 25 or 30% of the grade was based on attendance. So I had to
yeah,
take attendance each time, and it was a relatively small
uh-huh,
class of maybe 15 or 20
uh-huh,
people. And this was very much about values, purpose, integrity,
mm,
sustainability, non-extraction. And they would fake or have someone sign the attendance list when they were not there. And I lost my temper. I said,
mm,
"What the fuck are you doing here if you can't even,
mm,
admit you're not here, so don't sign, and that you commit this fraud?" And I was really
mm,
furious. I said, "You're not learning anything here if you can't even do this simple thing." And secondly, many of the students said, "I really want to go into impact and sustainability and purpose and all of this." But none of them did, or very few, only like one or two over the 4-year period. And they all went to A.T. Kearney and McKinsey, and they hated it. This drive for writing hours and never really achieving something. But very few of them ever did the advice. I actually showed, there's a TV show called Curb Your Enthusiasm
yes,
with
yes,
Larry David. And there's a
yeah,
scene in there where he gives advice to Leon how to get a job. So he says, "You want to get this job, you got to, start slowly asking more questions, and you flip it, and you're interviewing the recruiter."
mm,
And that's what I told him. If you want to change business, don't work for companies by, flipping it around with the recruiter. None of them did that. None of them did that.
mm,
And it was very disappointing, um, because it seemed that they talked about purpose and big purpose sustain, but they were just interested in large salaries and dying rich as quickly as possible.
mm, mm. I'm always a little uneasy when we make big generalizations about what all business school students are like, about their motivations or their backgrounds and so on. What I feel more comfortable about is talking about the sorts of knowledge and learning that business schools are currently encouraging, because the business school student, to some extent, is being produced by business school marketing and business school processes and business school graduation and all the rest of it. You know, it's that bit that interests me most. There's quite a lot of literature, particularly from sort of dodgy psychologists, who like suggesting that business school students are somehow more instrumental or more utilitarian, or they exhibit dark triad qualities or something along those lines, more likely to cheat, etc., etc. I'm always suspicious of that because it seems like it's blaming the students. You know, it's like, you know, it's their fault. It's that particular group. When I'd rather say, you know, the responsibility is ours as educators. We're the ones who are running the business schools. So let's try and run the schools differently in order to encourage the development of different kinds of values or behaviors or beliefs or something like that. Now, I don't know whether that chimes with your experience, Robert, you know, in terms
But
of,
I
yeah,
I was teaching a long time ago, you see the gray hair. So this must have been 15, close to 20 years ago, 18 years.
uh-huh.
Maybe people have changed. I was just there was really only one student in the 4 years that completely followed it. He became a professor at the American University in Paris and only teaching about sustainability, values, and leadership. You would get along really well with him. And it was very disappointing that so few didn't pursue their passion, their big purpose, and that was also when I decided I'm not going to do this. This is a waste of my time because the whole idea I did that was mainly to try to change the mindset of the influentials by finance, personnel,
Yeah,
reputation, and if I can get the ranked MBA school students
yeah,
starting to teach it, maybe we can kind of move the needle, but it was just too slow. Maybe
mm,
there's more interest now. Um, but this obsession about I really need the business school if I want to make a career in whatever, and it seems to me for always more about the networking than the knowledge.
yeah.
I mean, how many times do they use
Mm.
strategic finance when, they take this course? It's always in there. And how often are they using that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? And in a sense, what you're nudging at there is sort of what's our theory of education? What do we think education can do?
Exactly.
For many sociologists from the sort of the beginnings of educational sociology, really, there's this sort of idea that education can't compensate for society. That it's not possible to think about somehow dealing with a whole bunch of inequalities and life problems and structural difficulties and all the rest of it through an education system. Yeah. Now, if we apply that to, which isn't to say that education doesn't matter, it's rather to think it's not the one and only solution, which is sometimes the way that educationalists might like to imagine themselves. But thinking about this in the context of business schools, it seems to me that it would be foolish to say that even if we had fantastically, green and inclusive and democratic business education, that would simply change capitalism and make everything okay.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. But at the same time, the obverse seems to be unlikely as well. In other words, is it likely that we can change capitalism without a business school education system that is also trying to work towards green and democratic and inclusive business? Yeah. So, it's not like it's the complete answer, but it's surely part of the answer. But I mean, as your experience, by the sounds of it, is, it's just as important to think about incentives, for example, how the
Mm.
money moves and how people are rewarded for, different kinds of money and all the rest of it. So when you talked about, your students leaving and mostly not going into their businesses and so on, then of course, they're just recognizing what their experience of the world is, isn't it? When they leave the hallowed halls of the university, and then they see an economic system which rewards people for moving money in certain kinds of ways. Well, you're a bit daft or brave not to fall in line at that point.
But a lot of I mean, Madoff, Parmalat, many of the big frauds of
Mhm.
the corporate world, the CEO went to these ranked MBA schools,
Absolutely,
which
yeah.
is why I call them fraud factories.
Mhm.
I'm not saying they taught them to be fraudulent,
Mm.
but they instilled a certain extractive piracy approach to business.
Mm.
Not even hunting approach, a piracy approach.
Mm.
Not only there's no win-win, you must be destroyed, and then I must come out as the vanquished.
Yeah.
But I know that's not inherently their mission because they have lots of other things. What struck me the most is when I was on the curriculum committee, they told me that if anyone who at that time who was applying to the business school, because there was a small number and the rankings, were based on a relatively small number of people, if they said they were going to work at a nonprofit, they would not be accepted. I don't know if that's still the case then,
Mm,
but they were
mm,
so afraid of that they would
mm.
actually refuse someone who might have been a great student,
Yeah.
only because they wanted to help society and be
Mm,
happy with a lower paycheck.
yeah.
Uh, the students that you're teaching at Bristol, um, what are they looking for? I mean, what is
Mm,
their career ambition?
yeah. I mean, Bristol isn't a very typical place for a couple of reasons. One is that it's an old Victorian science institution, which is highly ranked, particularly in the kind of science, technology, engineering, and medicine, and so on, but has only very recently started to expand rapidly in business. So we don't have the kind of ranking position that London Business School or Warwick or somewhere does have in the UK, let alone globally. Um, Secondly, the a lot of the focus now, I think, is shifting towards, in the broadest of terms, kind of questions of sustainability and green stuff and so on. And that, I think, provides a rather different context. For myself, I've been talking about these kinds of questions for a long time now. And say, 20 or 30 years ago, if you raise the idea of, say, low carbon business or something, you'd get a bunch of people nodding, but it was relatively easy for people to dismiss this as being not an important question, not one that was being raised in the highest circles and so on. And so you could kind of smile and nod and bracket it, yeah, or of course, even deny that it was happening. Now that's impossible, right? You have to be as dumb as Donald Trump in order to deny the existence of climate change, right? It makes no sense for any reasonable person to be doing that. So if there's anybody listening to us today, then just switch off, because there's no point in what I'm going to say next. But effectively, what the opening the door to a critique of capitalism on the basis of climate change does is to, as soon as you do it, to really encourage us to think about the machinery that produces the economy that we have at present. Yeah, it allows for some really radical questions to be asked. Now, going back to the question that you asked me, what do my students want? I think my students want some answers to those kinds of questions. So most of the students I'm teaching, particularly the undergraduates, but postgraduates too, have been exposed to the facts of climate change for all of their lives. Okay, it's not news to them, any of this stuff. So they're not in a position to deny it. What they don't understand is how the global economy might be re-engineered in order that we're not producing these disastrous consequences for humans and non-humans alike. So that, it seems to me, is my responsibility. Yeah, is to say something along the lines of, well, this is the way that carbon capitalism has been operating up to the present, but there are these other ways of doing it, and there's lots, aren't there? We could talk about donut economics or circular economy or regenerative economy or whatever. There's plenty of different frames for all this kind of stuff, but I need to be talking about those things and giving them actual examples of ways in which people and business and finance and exchange and economy can operate differently. Yeah, that's what I want to give them. It's just the idea that it doesn't have to be like it has been. Yeah, that the future can be different to the past.
Yeah, I would imagine that the uber elite of the business schools are not happy with your comments.
I don't know, because it's difficult for them to deny this either, of course, isn't it? If we were to gather together a bunch of the best and brightest deans from global business schools, I doubt that any of them are in a position where they would want to be denying climate change. They will certainly be nodding and smiling at this stuff. What they probably don't quite understand is how they can retain their so-called market advantages or ranking advantages whilst teaching differently. Yeah, and that's in almost about marketing in a sense, isn't it? That in a previous institution I worked in, I was very keen, I was director of research at the time, that we really should be talking a lot more about alternative business and different ways of thinking about the economy and all the rest of it. And the main pushback we were having from that was the marketing people at the university. who were worried that if we sounded too much like, what, lefty hippies or something like that, that we wouldn't get particularly overseas students turning up and paying the bills. Yeah. So it more the strategy, and I've seen this in other institutions too. The strategy is more to kind of try and sound like everybody else rather than sounding different. And I think that's a massive mistake, massive mistake. We really should be trying to sound like, outliers, leaders right now, not giving them the tired old stories about, the fairy dust that we can sprinkle on your career, but talking about this as the most important challenge that faces our species right now. And you, if you come and study with us, could be part of finding the solutions to that challenge. Yeah, that seems to me quite an exciting thing to say to students. That's what I think we should be doing.
But because I always find, almost like many in the business school and with their secret handshakes if from alumni and their rugby shirts and it's almost like a cult.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. Maybe I just don't go to the same clubs that you do or something. I've I know quite a lot of business school deans, and they're not bad people or anything.
No, 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 no,
Some
no.
of
Of
them,
course
some
not.
of them are idiots, obviously, who are driven by personal ambition or the rest of it, and really have drunk the Kool-Aid. But many of them are, good people who are trying to, in some really complicated ways, produce a business school that they could be proud of. The difficulty is that there are so many countervailing pressures, both from within and without the institution, I think. So, just as I said with the students, that my job is to help them find solutions. So I would like to think that, that's my job if I was ever talking to a business school dean, is to kind of explain to them that you don't need to do the same thing as everybody else. One of the ways in which I characterized this I can't remember which, I think it might have been in the Against Management, sorry, the Shut Down the Business School book, was characterizing business school strategies as a bit being like penguins trying to keep warm in the cold. So
Mhm.
basically, everybody is huddling together and trying to get to the center of the pack. Yeah, something like that. And I just think that's such a disappointing response. And of course, in strategic terms, that just produces strategies that copy everybody else. It's an entirely mimetic thing, isn't it? So nobody is brave enough to strike out on their own because they're worried that the punters won't turn up and pay the bills.
Yeah. Um, I mean, going forward with, I remember during the financial crisis that during that time, um, hundreds of thousands of hundreds of thousands of employees were fired.
Mm-hmm.
But then I realized that the financial sector didn't get smaller, it got bigger. And despite the fact that hundreds of thousands, so normally if a business loses so many, it kind of contracts, but didn't happen. The financial only got bigger and bigger and bigger. So really, they didn't really add much value, or they were really inefficient, all of those people. Now, with, junior consultants, junior lawyers, not litigation people, but, all of the lawyers, accountants, communications advisors, financial people, a, a business school is not going to help them at all when they can easily be replaced by AI.
Yeah, and that's a big issue, but it's not just an issue for the business school, of course. That's an issue for
No, no, for
higher
for
education in
everyone.
general. That's right.
How do you
Yeah,
see the
yeah,
business schools in 5 or 10 years?
yeah, yeah. Gee, that's a horrible question, Robert. How do I see it in 5 or 10 years? I mean, one of the things that I think is happening is a very slow but pretty inexorable tilt towards the green stuff. And it's happening right the way across business school disciplines. It's kind of interesting to think about this in terms of a long wave. So if we look at some of the literature, mostly North American literature on the history of business schools, one of the things that we can see is that the earliest business schools, Wharton, Harvard, and so on, were very often concerned in a much more profound way with the values of the business class. Yeah. And this is particularly important during the 1920s, 1930s, when, of course, the business class is having to legitimate itself in all sorts of ways against the obscene excesses of the Gilded Age and the Depression and all the rest of it. The way the story usually goes, though, is that by the 1970s, what we see in business schools is a kind of takeover by the finance class, in which ideas about shareholder value and managerial agency and all the rest of it add up to the dominance of a kind of a set of assumptions, which are usually called something like neoliberalism. Yeah. And so perhaps it's possible to say that over the last 50 years, what we've seen in business schools is the dominance of neoliberal ideas. That's to say, market-based versions of individual choice and so on. And that's shaped the way that business schools have taught and researched. But we might be at the end of that long wave now. It might be that we're moving towards a set of more collective or communitarian or long-term assumptions about the way that business schools should be teaching and thinking about the future of the economy with regard to the planet. Now, I hope I'm right in that, because I'd like to think, despite the title of my book, that we don't need to shut down the business schools, but rather that we need them to change radically in terms of the way in which they teach us about what it means to be human, what economies are, what organizations are, what markets are, and so on. And that might involve the dethroning of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism is, it's difficult to see how neoliberal ideas, market-based ideas, are going to easily address climate change, for example. We're going to need some rather more collective and interventionist policies in order to deal with things like the pricing of aviation fuel or carbon taxation, global carbon taxation, or whatever. We're looking at some pretty big collectivist policies in order to deal with that. So that's going to require some profound changes in terms of the way that we think about the relationship between business, the human being, and the state.
What motive? I mean, sometimes it can feel overwhelming when you're very purpose driven. You're not materialistic. That's why you're teaching at a university. If you want to be rich, that's not the quickest way to do that. Certainly not from selling academic books. So what is your drive? What is your big purpose? What keeps you going? Because it can be in between the politics of academia and the challenges, and sometimes I'm worrying, am I getting through to these students? How do you keep it real?
I don't know. I'm always suspicious when people start talking about their values. It's kind of like, I'm English, and you don't wear your values on your sleeve. That's sort of suspicious. I think there's two ways for me to talk about this. One is in terms of the idea of the university itself. So for me, higher education is a space that allows us to think the unthinkable, to open up questions that are not normally encouraged to be opened up in everyday life, particularly in the sphere of work organizations and so on. And I'm really passionate. I hate people who say that. I'm very keen. I'm very keen on the idea of protecting the space of the university as some sort of guarantee for our democratic freedoms and our possibility to think different futures. Yeah. So that's part of it, but then you'd expect that from someone who's spent their entire career in higher education. The other bit of it, though, and this is going to sound a bit cheesy, but it's true, is to think about my kids and grandkids, I'm at the tail end of the baby boom generation and have been incredibly lucky in terms of my employment, the fact that, I haven't had to engage in any major wars. Western Europe's been pretty quiet over the last 50 years or so. And that's an amazing privilege, isn't it? But I find it difficult now, particularly given the kind of polycrisis that surrounds us, to imagine that's going to be the case for my kids or my grandchildren. And so in a tiny, tiny, tiny way, I'd like to think that I was trying to contribute to producing a quieter planet for them. Yeah, that seems like a worthwhile goal. And what I'm doing is infinitesimally small. It's no more than a kind of a consolation prize of some kind. But I'm not sure I could look myself in the mirror in the morning if I wasn't doing and saying the things that I'm doing now.
And you enjoy what you're doing.
I love it. It's brilliant.
I
Absolutely.
mean, it's always
Yeah.
fantastic to meet people that
Yeah.
get, that doing something that gives them energy, that it doesn't
Mm,
cost them energy.
mm, absolutely. I mean, I just think it's an extraordinary privilege to be, I mean, despite all the obstacles in terms of the way that universities are changing and the planet is changing and, the rise of populism and all the rest of it, that there are so many reasons not to get out of bed in the morning just to pull the video out and
I hear
cry,
you.
right? But at the same time, that gives me an awful lot of reasons to carry on saying the things that I've been saying, and certainly it feels very often like you're just, shouting in an empty lecture theatre. But sometimes, I get through. I get invited to talk on podcasts like yours, Robert, or somebody buys or reads something that I've written. That's enough. That's enough for me. For now, anyway. We'll see.
And the uh do you do you have any specific new grand ambition that you would like to achieve within the context of Bristol University or another university?
No, no, I'm very happy at Bristol, and it's a great city and a very permissive university for me to work in, and people have been very supportive about the kinds of things I want to do. The main thing I want to achieve over the next couple of years is really to work at embedding the university in the city, as effectively as I possibly can, because I do think, particularly, I assume this is the case in other countries too, but that the university is sometimes a rather separated, a rather cloistered space.
Right.
And as I said, in the city of Bristol, we've got an enormous number of amazingly impressive green initiatives of various different kinds. Bristol was European Green Capital in 2015.
Yeah, yeah,
And so
yeah.
there are a whole bunch of organizations in pretty much just every sphere of the economy that are kind of centered around the Bristol economy, and we can learn from them. And maybe, who knows, perhaps they can learn from us a bit. So trying to get the university as connected as possible to the city is what I'd like to achieve. And I'm not the only person doing that. There's
Mm.
other people involved in that. One of the things that I wanted to do when I started here, but for a variety of reasons it never happened, was to kind of curate a course in which the city taught. Yeah. So basically, the academics would have the back seat, and we'd have a whole bunch of activists who are working on food and transport and energy and the rest of it, who would talk about their businesses and how it worked, and then the students would go and work in those businesses and the rest of it. I still think that'd be a fantastic model. It's probably not one that I have time to do before my retirement,
Mm.
but the idea of the university, of all universities, being, rather than being separated and cloistered places, being heavily involved in the life and economy of the cities that they're part of, is one that I think would be a really useful change.
And I admire the fact that I mean I I often don't have a filter, so I will kind of shout the radical truth and for me, and tell people that I'm sorry, but their children are ugly, and they don't always like to hear that.
Yeah, I
But
can't
I
imagine how you
admire
get
the
sacked.
I admire the fact that we kind of share the idea that there's something missing in the present
Mm,
business school, or it's not functioning in an optimal manner. But you speak about that in a much more conciliatory
uh,
terms. You're
yeah.
not saying this is you, although the book title was quite provocative.
Mm,
Shut
mm,
down all the business schools, I think it was called.
yeah, yeah. Shut down the business school.
Or was
Yeah,
that did
yeah.
did the when you did that, did your friend or partner say, Martin, what are you doing?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think there are political choices here, right? So what you're describing in terms of me being conciliatory is an account of a kind of entryist politics. So, working within an institution in order to try and change it. And I guess that's what part of my political bet is in a lot of the work that I've done with business schools. There's to kind of, to in a sense, shame them, to say, you're claiming these kinds of things about the grand challenges or the UN goals or whatever it is. Why don't you do them? Why don't you? Oh, and your students care about these kinds of things, and everybody claims to care about the planet, blah 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 blah. So these are the things that you need to do in order to make that change. That's essentially, it's conciliatory in the sense that it's not simply about blowing up the institution. On the other hand, sometimes I run out of patience with that kind of politics, and it's at that point I think that thinking about alternatives to universities might become rather important. Many of the groups that I have worked with and know of within the city of Bristol, for example, are doing their stuff without any particular reference to the university. They're trying to create a new food system or thinking about alternative energy production or whatever it's sustainable energy production and the rest of it. They don't need the university to do those things. And, very often the university it's a slow, conservative institution that they don't particularly want to hold hands with because they can move faster and be more radical outside it. Now, I think both of those are just different strategies. There's a kind of, the sort of the strategy of being an external critic or the strategy of being an internal critic. And I guess we need both of them. Yeah. And I sort of flip between them. Yeah. But sure, I mean, sometimes I sound conciliatory. I don't think it's always productive to tell people that their children are ugly,
No,
even if you think so.
no, I arm wrestle with my wife about that. She has no filter at all, zero filter, but has done two
Okay.
PhDs.
All right.
Um,
I'd love to be at your dinner table. It sounds like a sparkly place.
Oh, yeah, it's very embarrassing sometimes with people who are not familiar
Mm.
with her because she actually she did those two PhDs and she built a very successful vocational hotel school in Bhutan.
Wow.
And because she says, dude, we don't need more management schools for hotels. We need people who actually work there
Yeah.
who don't have a job.
Yeah.
And that's vocational
Yeah.
training.
Yeah.
How can those that are listening to this video or podcast help
Mhm.
you? What can we do to help you, make your dreams come true? And we're
Yes.
not in
Yeah.
cosmetics.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, one of the things I'd be really, really happy to receive is any kind of examples of the way in which business markets, exchange organization, and so on is operating differently. Quite often, I would use these in my writing and my teaching in order to explain to people how it is possible to do stuff differently. Because lots of the kind of the case studies that are standardly deployed within the business school of course, have all sorts of embedded assumptions about the way that money should move or the way that
Right.
people are motivated and so on. So if people can tell me different stories about the present, I'd love to hear them. I'd be really, really interested. The other element of this, of course, is that I would like many of these radical business people to be involved with their local business schools, to try and pull them, to be strange attractors in a sense, that just to try and give the business school deans and senior staff the courage to move away from some of their received wisdoms. And having a bunch of advisors or allies to hold hands with might be really useful for many of these people.
And we can post your LinkedIn name if the
Of
people
course.
respond to
Yes, of
that.
course. Happy to do that. And there's just if you just Google my name, there's a whole bunch of publications. So yeah, and you're absolutely right to say that I'm not getting rich by selling books, but hey, if any of your viewers or listeners want to buy any of my books, then I'm very very happy to oblige. Just think about it, making an old man very happy.
Okay, then we'll add the link. If you can send me the link to the book or the link to your website, if your book is on
Will do.
there, we'll
Yeah,
post that
that'd
when
be
we
great.
post
Yeah,
the
yeah.
replay. This has been a joy, and also I really admire that you're not you understand where people are, and you're not saying, "What are you, an idiot for being over there? We should be over here."
Yeah,
And in a polite way, trying to nudge them,
yeah,
slowly get them into the position that they might actually feel even more comfortable. So that's
yeah,
really
yeah,
cool that you're doing that. And
yeah.
I admire, I don't know if I don't think I have the patience for that, but I do admire people who can do that. So thank you
Yeah,
for that, and thank you to the
it's a pleasure,
students.
and I'm sure you'd like to say that my children were very beautiful.
Absolutely, 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 absolutely. So thank you so much, Martin. It's been a joy. I'll send you the let me just stop the
Yeah, yeah.
recording.
Okay. Yeah,
Uh,
brilliant.